The skies above the royal capital burned with streaks of fire as enemy ships entered the planet's orbit. Alarms rang across the city, their wailing mixing with the shouts of soldiers and civilians running for shelter. Princess Alara stood on the balcony of the high citadel, her armored hands gripping the railing as she watched the first explosions in the distance. She had known this day might come, but not so soon and not like this. The invaders were not strangers. They were her own blood nobles from the outer colonies who claimed she was unfit to rule because she had no husband. Galactic Law stated that, without a royal marriage by the time of her coronation, her crown would pass to the nearest male heir. That heir was her cousin, Lord Varen, a man who had already sent assassins after her twice. Now he had come with fleets, using the law as both sword and shield. Inside the war chamber, advisors argued over desperate plans. Some wanted to surrender to avoid bloodshed, others urged her to flee to the mountains and form a rebellion. Alara stayed silent, her mind fixed on the only loophole she had left. If she married, and if her chosen husband was recognized by the Galactic Court, Varen would lose all claim. But the suitor would have to be someone with enough power to challenge him, and that meant looking far beyond her own people. Her thoughts turned to the man she had met only once, in the ashes of another battlefield. A human mercenary named Kale, who had fought against overwhelming odds and somehow turned defeat into victory. He had no title, no wealth, but his reputation among the alien alliances was unlike any other. Some called him reckless, others called him dangerous. But to Alara, he was something more. He was unpredictable, and unpredictability could win wars. The council's voices faded as she made her decision. She would find Kale, and she would ask him to marry her. Not for love, not for tradition, but for the survival of her throne. The risk was immense. Humans were rare in the galaxy, and Kale was known for refusing every offer of allegiance. She had nothing to offer him but the promise of war and danger. Yet it was a gamble she had to take. She donned her ceremonial armor, a suit of emerald and silver plates etched with the crest of her house. Her crown rested lightly on her braids, but it felt heavier than steel. The royal guards fell in behind her as she strode to the landing pad. Her personal corvette awaited, its engines already warming. She ordered her crew to prepare for a jump to the neutral frontier, where Kale was. Last seen, the flight would take them through contested space, where enemy ships prowled like wolves. The moment the corvette cleared the city shields, they were in open war. Pirate vessels and Varen's scouts swarmed in the void, trying to cut off her escape. The pilot weaved through burning wreckage and shattered satellites, while Alara stood in the center of the deck, steady as a stone. She would not let fear show on her face. If Kale was to see her as a ruler worth standing beside, she had to reach him with her dignity intact. Hours later, they broke free into the calmer dark of the frontier zone. No law ruled here, only the strength of those who claimed it. The corvette landed on a barren outpost world, its surface a sea of wind-blown dust and jagged rock. In the distance, through the shimmering heat, she saw the figure she had crossed half the galaxy for. Kale stood outside a battered hangar, a long rifle slung over his shoulder, his expression unreadable as she approached. The weight of her crown seemed to vanish, replaced by the pounding of her heart as she opened her mouth to speak. Kale did not bow or speak right away. He studied Alara with the same measured gaze he might use on a dangerous weapon. The wind tore at his coat and the dust swirled between them, but he did not seem moved by the sight of a princess in full armor standing on his doorstep. His silence pressed against her like a wall, testing her patience. Finally he asked why she had come, his voice low and edged with caution. She told him the truth. Her cousin was moving to claim her throne under Galactic Law. The law demanded she marry or lose her crown. She explained the fleets he had sent, the war at her borders, and the lives that would be lost if she failed. Kale listened without interrupting, his eyes never leaving hers. When she finished, There was no sign of pity in his expression, only a question. Why him? Elara stepped closer, lowering her voice. Because he was feared by her enemies and respected by those who hated her family. Because he had no allegiance to her cousin or any of the ruling houses. Because he could fight with a mind as sharp as a blade, and because in the eyes of the Galactic Court, a human husband would be outside the reach of her rival's influence. She told him he was the only choice she had left. Kale's mouth curved. Slightly, though not in a smile. He asked what she was offering in return. Gold, power, command over her fleets? Elara shook her head. She could not promise him safety or wealth. All she could offer was the war itself, and the right to stand beside her as king. He laughed once, a short, dry sound, and said that kingship had never been his dream. Yet she saw something shift in his eyes when she spoke of Varen's cruelty. She told him of the assassinations, the burned villages, and the treaties her cousin had already broken. She told him that if she fell, Varen's reach would grow beyond her world and into the systems Kale had fought to keep free. The air between them grew heavier. He knew she was right. In silence, he weighed the danger against the chance to strike at an enemy worth fighting. The wind carried the sound of distant engines from the horizon. Kale finally said he would not give an answer here in the open. If Varen's men were hunting her, they would find her soon enough. He told her to follow him inside. The hangar was dim, lit only by strips of old lights hanging from the ceiling. A half-disassembled fighter craft sat in the middle, its metal skin scorched from old battles. Around it were crates of weapons, spare parts, and fuel cells stacked in careful order. This was no palace, but it was a fortress in its own way. As they walked, she noticed maps pinned to the far wall, marked with routes through contested space. Every line told the story of raids, escapes, and ambush Kale had survived. She understood then why the legends about him never matched from one telling to the next. He was a ghost to his enemies, never staying in one place long enough to be cornered. She wondered if she could convince such a man to tie his fate to hers. Before she could ask again, the warning alarm on his console began to sound. Kale crossed the room in 3 strides, scanning the sensor display. A small convoy was approaching fast from the south ridge. 3 ships armed, moving in tight formation. Elara felt her heart quicken. Varen's scouts had found her. Kale looked at her once more, then at the door, then back at her. His voice was calm when he said that if she truly wanted him as her husband, this was her first test. Together, they would have to fight their way out of here. The hangar doors shook as the first blast struck from outside. Dust rained down from the rafters, and the sound of metal groaning filled the air. Kale moved quickly, tossing a rifle to Elara. She caught it without hesitation, her fingers wrapping around the grip like someone who had held weapons before. The next hit made the walls vibrate, and Kale signaled for her to take cover behind a stack of fuel crates. He crouched beside her, his voice low but steady. The ships outside would land soon, and once they did, soldiers would pour through those doors. He asked her if she could hold her ground under fire. She met his eyes and nodded. She had been trained since childhood to fight, though most of her battles had been in ceremonial drills and palace guard exercises. Today would be different. Today she would fight for her life. The engines outside roared as the first ship touched down. Kale glanced at the entry sensors and adjusted his rifles. Settings. He told her to wait for his signal before firing. When the doors began to open, sunlight flooded the dark hangar, silhouetting the first wave of armored soldiers. They moved with confidence, expecting little resistance. Kale raised his weapon, and Elara mirrored his stance. He gave a sharp nod, and the air filled with the thunder of gunfire. Elara fired with precision, each shot finding its target. The soldiers faltered, some falling before they could even clear the doorway. Kale moved like a shadow, never staying in one place long enough to be an easy mark. The smell of scorched metal and burned air filled the space. More troops rushed forward, stepping over the bodies of the fallen. Ilara felt her pulse race, but she did not back away. Instead, she pressed forward, firing again and again. A blast from an enemy rifle struck the crate near her, sending shards of metal into her arm. Pain flared, but she gritted her teeth and shifted her aim. Kale noticed the hit but said nothing, knowing she could still fight. They had to hold until the attackers either retreated or were all down. The ground beneath them shook again as the second enemy ship landed. Kale shouted for her to fall back toward the fighter in the center of the hangar. They reached the craft just as another volley of fire tore through the upper walls. Kale leaped into the cockpit and began powering the systems. He told her to cover the hangar entrance while he prepared for takeoff. Ilara took position by the wing, picking off any soldier who tried to advance. She could feel the heat of the engines as they came alive, the vibrations running through the floor. Kale called out that they had 30 seconds before liftoff. The soldiers made one last push, rushing through the doorway in a tight formation. Ilara's rifle clicked empty, and she drew the blade from her hip. The attackers did not expect her to close the distance so quickly. Steel clashed against alloy armor, and she cut through their line with a force that surprised even herself. Kale shouted for her to get aboard. She leapt into the rear seat as the fighter lifted off the ground, leaving the hangar in chaos. Outside, the battlefield stretched below them. Two enemy ships gave chase, firing at their thrusters. Kale twisted the fighter through sharp turns, using the rocky terrain for cover. Ilara manned the rear guns, sending precise bursts toward their pursuers. One ship caught fire and spiraled into the ground. The other pulled back, unwilling to follow them further into the dangerous canyons. Ahead, Kale eased the fighter into a high climb, leaving the dust and smoke behind them. When they reached the edge of the planet's atmosphere, Kale glanced at her. He asked again if she truly wanted him to be her husband, knowing now the dangers that would follow. Ilara met his gaze without flinching. She told him she had already decided. She did not want a king who would hide behind palace walls. She wanted a partner who would fight beside her, no matter the odds. Kale was silent for a moment, then gave a slow, deliberate nod asterisk. The fighter's descent into Ilara's capital was anything but quiet. Sirens blared from the walls as the guards recognized her ship, and civilians looked up in shock at the sight of a human in the co-pilot's seat. Kale kept his expression calm, scanning the streets below. His presence alone would spark rumors, but Ilara knew that was part of the plan. If word spread that she had returned with an outsider, her cousin's spies would hear it by nightfall. They landed in the royal courtyard, where armored sentries lined the marble steps. The captain of the guard approached, bowing to Ilara, but his eyes lingered on Kale. Whispers rippled through the ranks as they realized this was the human mercenary, whose name was feared across the outer systems. Kale offered no greeting, stepping aside to let her walk ahead. Every soldier's gaze followed him, measuring him as if trying to decide whether he was ally or threat. Inside the throne hall, the council was already gathered. Their robes shimmered under the high crystal lights, and their voices rose in protest the moment they saw Kale. One elder demanded to know why she had brought a human into the sacred hall. Another accused her of desperation, unbecoming of a ruler. Ilara did not flinch. She told them plainly that Kale was her chosen protector, and more than that, the man she intended to marry to fulfill the law. The reaction was instant. Some gasped. Others shouted, and one counselor even stood so quickly his chair toppled. Kale watched without a word, reading each face. These were not warriors. They were politicians, bound by tradition but quick to abandon it when it suited them. Ilara's voice cut through the noise, reminding that her cousin's fleet was still at their borders. If they wasted time arguing, there would be nothing left to rule. A few of the council members exchanged uneasy glances. They knew the law was clear. If she married before her coronation, Varen's claim would be void. Yet they feared the political chaos that might follow a union with a human. Ilara met their hesitation with steel in her voice. She reminded them that Kale had fought and bled to reach her side. He had no ambition for their crown, only the will to defend it from those who would destroy it. Kale finally spoke, his words measured and firm. He told the council that he was not here to beg for acceptance. He did not care for their titles or their approval. His only interest was in standing beside Ilara to face the enemy she could not fight alone. If they wished to doubt him, they could do so while he kept their enemies from tearing down their walls. The hall fell silent under the weight of his voice. Ilara seized the moment. She declared her intent to begin the marriage rites within 3 days. As required by the Galactic Court, she ordered preparations for the binding ceremony. Knowing that once the first stage was public, Varen would have little time to act before it was complete. The council, though still uneasy, could find no lawful objection. One by one, they bowed in reluctant acceptance, though some eyes still held suspicion. After the meeting, Ilara and Kale walked through the gardens behind the hall. The air was warm with the scent of flowering vines, and the distant towers glimmered. In the afternoon sun, Kale asked her if she was certain about the path they were taking. She told him certainty was a luxury she could no longer afford. Every step forward was a choice between survival and surrender, and she refused to surrender while she still drew breath. Kale stopped by the fountain, watching the water spill into the marble basin. He said nothing for a long moment, then told her that if they were to stand as partners, he would need full authority in battle. She agreed without hesitation. In that moment, she realized that giving him command in war meant trusting him not just with her throne, but with her people's lives. It was a trust she had never given to anyone before. The news of Ilara's planned marriage spread faster than any royal decree in memory. By the next sunrise, the streets were alive with whispers. Some citizens celebrated, believing Kale's reputation would keep the enemy at bay. Others doubted a human could understand the weight of a crown. In the shadows of the city, Varen's agents carried different whispers. Ones meant to stir unrest and fear among the people. Kale spent the day inspecting the city's defenses. The outer gates were strong, but the inner wall had sections weakened from years without repair. He ordered work crews to reinforce them immediately. Soldiers who had once eyed him with suspicion now followed his commands without hesitation. They saw the way he moved through the training yards, correcting stances, demonstrating strikes, and testing their discipline until their arms ached. His presence was not gentle, but it inspired strength. Ilara, meanwhile, oversaw the first stage of the marriage rites. In the great temple, she stood before the high priestess, offering the ceremonial oath that marked her intent. The golden braids in her hair gleamed under the torchlight, and her voice carried through the marble hall without a tremor. She knew Varen's spies would be watching from the crowd. Every word she spoke was another nail sealing his defeat. But it also painted a target on her back. That night, as the city settled into uneasy rest, Kale's instincts kept him awake. He stood at the balcony of his quarters, watching the streets below. The torches of the patrols burned like small stars against the darkness. Something about their pattern bothered him. He realized too many were moving toward the east gate. He grabbed his rifle and moved without calling the guards, trusting his own judgment over protocol. Near the east gate, the air smelled of smoke. Kale found 2 sentries lying unconscious, their weapons missing. Beyond them, shadows moved swiftly, carrying satchels toward the wall's base. He raised his rifle, and the nearest figure dropped before it could light the fuse. The others scattered, but Kale pursued, his boots pounding against the cobblestones. His shots were precise, dropping the saboteurs one by one until none remained. Standing, by the time the alarm bells rang, Kale had already dragged the surviving attackers into the guardhouse. Ilara arrived minutes later, still dressed in her ceremonial gown. Her eyes swept over the prisoners, recognizing the insignia on their armor. These were Varen's elite agents, trained to slip past any defense. She felt a chill as she realized how close they had come to destroying the gate before the marriage rites were complete. Kale explained what he had seen and how he had acted. The captain of the guard bowed his head in shame for not detecting the breach sooner. Ilara did not waste time with blame. She ordered double patrols and tighter security across all gates. Then she turned to Kale, her voice low but certain, and told him that from this moment, his authority in defending the city was equal to hers. In that instant, the partnership became real. Over the next 2 days, preparations for both the wedding and the coming battle continued side by side. The temple bells rang each morning for the rites, while the clang of hammers echoed each night as walls were strengthened. Kale drilled the soldiers with relentless focus, and Ilara moved among the people, speaking of unity and resilience. Together, they began to weave loyalty not just from law, but from trust earned in action. On the eve of the second stage of the ceremony, a messenger arrived breathless at the palace gates. Viren's fleet had been sighted approaching from the outer orbit. They would reach the capital in less than a day. The council panicked, urging Ilara to delay the rites until the threat had passed. She refused. If they postponed now, it would signal weakness. Instead, she declared that the rites would proceed on schedule, even under the shadow of war. The dawn of the ceremony day came with a blood-red sky. The temple bells rang, their deep tones echoing through the streets, calling citizens to witness the binding rites. Soldiers lined every road leading to the temple, their armor gleaming under the morning light. Kale walked beside Ilara, his eyes scanning every rooftop and shadow. Above them, the distant roar of engines hinted that Viren's fleet was already descending toward the capital. Inside the temple, the air was thick with incense and anticipation. The high priestess stood at the altar, her silver robes flowing as she prepared the sacred documents. Nobles and commoners alike filled the great hall, their whispers soft but urgent. Kale stood close enough to Ilara to shield her if needed, yet far enough to keep the focus on her role as ruler. Every face in the room turned as she stepped forward, her crown catching the light. The priestess began the ancient words that would mark the union. Each phrase was steeped in centuries of tradition, binding not only hearts but political power. Ilara repeated her vows with steady voice, her gaze fixed ahead. Kale remained silent, listening, aware of the guards shifting uneasily by the door. The moment the final vow was spoken, a deep tremor shook the floor beneath them. Dust fell from the high ceiling, and the hall erupted in alarm. A blast tore through the temple's outer wall, scattering stone and debris across the ceremonial floor. Screams rose from the crowd as armored soldiers poured in, their insignia marked with Varen's crest. Kale moved instantly, pulling Ilara behind one of the marble pillars while drawing his rifle. The guards engaged the intruders, steel clashing against steel, but the enemy had the advantage of surprise. Smoke filled the air, stinging eyes and throats. Ilara refused to cower. She drew her blade, the ceremonial weapon now turned to war. Beside her, Kale fired with precision, each shot cutting down another attacker. The priestess was rushed to safety by the temple acolytes, while the citizens scrambled for the exits. The enemy pressed forward, their leader shouting to capture Ilara alive. That single command told Kale everything Viren wanted her taken. Before the rites could be completed, Kale signaled to the remaining guards to form a shield wall around the altar. If they could hold the enemy here, the final part of the ceremony could still be spoken. Ilara moved with them, striking at any foe who breached their defense. The clash was fierce, echoing through the temple like thunder. For every attacker that fell, two more seemed to take their place. But Kale's presence kept the line from breaking. Above them, the stained glass windows shattered as enemy drones descended, spraying the floor with energy bolts. Kale leapt to cover Alara, firing upward until the machines crashed in sparks. The heat of battle blurred the edges of the moment, yet Alara's focus never wavered. She turned to the priestess who had returned to the altar and shouted for her to finish the rites no matter what happened. The priestess's voice rose over the chaos, speaking the final binding words. Kale and Alara stood side by side, their weapons ready, as the vow sealed before all witnesses. A brilliant pulse of light erupted from the altar, a symbol recognized by Galactic Law as proof of union. The enemy hesitated, realizing they were now attacking the crowned queen and her consort under protected status. That hesitation cost them dearly as Kale led the counterattack. Within minutes, the remaining invaders were either dead or in retreat. The temple floor was littered with the fallen, both friend and foe. Alara stood amid the ruin, her gown torn and her crown dented, but her head held high. Kale lowered his rifle, scanning for any remaining threat. The bells began to ring again. This time not for ceremony, but for victory. The marriage was complete, and Viren's claim had been shattered. The capital did not rest after the attack on the temple. Fires still smoldered in the outer districts where enemy shells had struck. Citizens worked side by side with soldiers to clear the rubble and tend to the wounded. Kale moved among them, giving orders for barricades and weapon placements. Alara joined him, her presence lifting morale as she thanked each worker and guard personally. The sound of hammering and marching boots filled the air as the city braced for the next strike. High in the war tower, scouts reported that Viren's fleet had gathered beyond the planet's moon. Dozens of warships floated in formation, their weapons hot and ready. The council urged Alara to flee to the mountain strongholds and command from there. Kale rejected the idea immediately. If the queen abandoned the capital, the people's courage would break. He told them the fight had to be here, where every citizen could see they were not forsaken. Alara backed him without hesitation. She ordered every able-bodied citizen to assist in the defense, whether by carrying supplies, tending to the injured, or reinforcing the walls. Her voice carried over the courtyard as she spoke to the gathered crowd. She told them this battle was not only for her crown, but for their homes and families. If Viren won, none of them would be free again. The crowd roared their defiance, swearing to stand until the last. Through the night, Kale oversaw the arming of the city's anti-air batteries. Crews worked in shifts to ensure no weapon was left unmanned. He walked the walls, checking firing, arcs and sight lines, correcting mistakes without raising his voice. Soldiers who had once doubted him now looked to him as their anchor. Even the most seasoned veterans admitted that his calm under pressure gave them a reason to believe they could win. At dawn, the first shadow fell across the city as Viren's fleet emerged from behind the moon. The enemy ships advanced in perfect lines, their hulls glinting like blades under the pale sun. Kale ordered the outer gates sealed and the wall catapults loaded. The air grew tense as every defender took position. Somewhere in the distance, the low hum of the enemy's main engines grew into a roar. Then, without warning, the first salvo of plasma fire streaked toward the city. The outer shield flared bright as it absorbed the first wave of attacks. Kale shouted for the batteries to return fire. Massive bolts of energy leapt from the walls, striking the lead enemy vessels. One ship exploded, scattering molten fragments into space. The rest closed in, launching smaller craft toward the ground. Within minutes, drop pods slammed into the streets, spilling soldiers into the fight. The battle for the capital had begun. Kale moved from barricade to barricade, directing fire and reinforcing weak points. Alara fought alongside the palace guard, her blade flashing in the sunlight as she cut down any enemy who came within reach. The people fought as fiercely as the soldiers, turning market stalls into choke points and alleys into deadly traps. Every street became a battlefield, and every defender knew retreat was not an option. By midday, the fighting reached the steps of the royal courtyard. Enemy troops swarmed the main gate, hammering at its reinforced steel. Kale ordered the inner defenses to hold position until the enemy breached, then strike with full force. When the gate finally gave way, the attackers poured in only to be met by a wall of defenders who pushed them back with brutal precision. The clash shook the ground, but the line did not break. In the war tower, Alara received word that 3 more enemy ships had been destroyed by the city's guns. The tide was beginning to turn, but the cost was high. The wounded filled every hall and courtyard, yet the defenders refused to yield. Kale rejoined her at the tower, blood on his armor, but no injury slowing him. He told her they could win, but only if they pressed the advantage before Varen himself entered the fight. The sky above the capital burned with fire as the largest of Varen's warships descended through the clouds. Its shadow swept over the city, blocking the light and filling the streets with a deep, oppressive gloom. The defenders on the walls paused for only a breath before resuming their fire. Kale stood at the front of the royal courtyard, his rifle ready, his eyes fixed on the descending vessel. He knew Varen was coming for them personally. Inside the palace, Alara tightened the straps of her battle armor. The golden crown still rested on her head, dented from the temple attack but unbroken. She stepped into the hall where her captains awaited, each kneeling in respect before rising to hear her orders. She told them there would be no retreat, no negotiation, and no surrender. This battle would decide the fate of their world. The captains saluted and moved to their positions. Varen's warship landed outside the shattered east gate. The ground trembled as its massive ramp lowered. Armored soldiers marched down in perfect formation, their banners snapping in the wind. At the center of the formation walked Varen himself, clad in black and crimson armor, his face hidden behind a mask of polished steel. His voice carried across the courtyard as he demanded the surrender of the queen and her human consort. Kale stepped forward, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. He told Varen there would be no surrender, and that the only way to claim the crown would be to take it from Alara's lifeless body. The crowd of defenders roared their defiance. Varen's soldiers surged forward, and the courtyard erupted. In chaos, Kale's rifle barked fire, cutting down the first wave. While Alara led the palace guard into the thick of the fighting, the battle raged with unrelenting fury. Steel clashed against steel, and the air filled with the cries of the wounded. Kale moved like a force of nature, striking with precision and never lingering in one place. Alara fought at his side, their movements in perfect harmony. Every time an enemy tried to flank one, the other was there to block or strike. Together, they turned the tide, pushing Varen's forces back step by step. Finally, the enemy line split as Kale and Alara drove straight toward Varen. The masked warlord met their charge with the sweep of his massive blade, forcing them both to leap aside. His strength was as great as his ambition, each blow shaking the stones beneath their feet. Kale countered with a rapid series of strikes, forcing Varen to step back. Alara seized the opening, her sword flashing toward his exposed side. Varen caught her blade with his gauntlet, twisting it aside and shoving her back. Kale moved in before Varen could follow through, firing a burst from his rifle that shattered the warlord's mask. The steel fell away, revealing a face twisted with rage and arrogance. Varen roared and charged, but Kale sidestepped, driving the butt of his rifle into the warlord's knee. Alara came in from the other side, her blade aimed true. The strike pierced Varen's armor, sinking deep into his chest. His eyes widened in disbelief as the strength drained from his body. He staggered back, dropping his weapon, and fell to his knees. Around them, his soldiers faltered, their will to fight breaking as their leader collapsed. Kale stood over him, but it was Alara who spoke the final words, declaring the battle over and the crown secure. Varen fell forward, motionless, the remaining enemy forces surrendered, laying down their arms. The defenders erupted in cheers that echoed through the city. The bells rang from every tower, not for warning, but for triumph. Alara turned to Kale, her armor scorched and her crown streaked with blood, and thanked him in front of all assembled. In that moment, their partnership became more than a political necessity. It became the foundation of a united kingdom. In the days that followed, the city rebuilt under their joint rule. The people celebrated not just the victory, but the marriage that had saved their world. Alara and Kale stood together on the palace balcony, looking out over the restored streets. The sun dipped low on the horizon, casting golden light across the towers. For the first time since the war began, there was peace, and it was theirs to protect.